Welcome back to the next episode of TMT with Mike O'Reilly. My guest, Eric Berger, and I want to get your title right because it is extensive here. Research Director and Research Professor of NextG Security at the Commonwealth Cyber Initiative, with appointments as Research Professor of Electrical and Computer Engineering and Research Professor of Public and International Affairs at Virginia Tech. Did I get that right?
That was right. Great. Thank you.
All right. That is the longest title of anyone we've had so far, and it shows your expertise. So I'm really pleased that you joined us today to share some thoughts on a bunch of different issues. But before we get there, maybe you can give me a little bit of your background. How did you get to this point? What led you here? What's your career background?
Yeah, absolutely. In the very beginning, I was trying to decide between music performance and engineering. And I'd gone to pre-college of a well-known music school. And while I was there, I realized, and I'd started an orchestra. And so I knew how much it cost to start an orchestra. And I knew that was very hard. And I played a small instrument, oboe. So there wouldn't be 10,000 people applying for an opening. There'd be 500. But anywhere in the world, it's the same 500 people. And I was looking at, how many people have to die before I get a position? And then I realized as an engineer, I could buy an orchestra. So then I went for research. Worked at the Texas Instruments Central Research Labs, which for telecommunications, my group invented the single-chip digital signal processor. But this is also telling you a little bit about research. That was like 1979, 1980, when the first products came out in the 90s. So, you do stuff, it takes a while to figure out, what are we going to do with it? And it ended up, we're going to drive telecommunications. I ended up going to a private company doing more semiconductor design, and I quickly ended up in management. I was trying to figure out, do I want to do research and get my PhD, or do you want to do management, get my MBA, and I got my MBA. And then I looked, and this again in the 80s, looking at my mentors who were vice presidents of engineering, most of them had some commercial experience. So I asked my company, and I ended up doing direct sales, quota carrying, knocking on the doors, largest electronics firm in Europe. And I really, really appreciate people who do that, but I can't do the roller coaster ride. Came back to the US and moved to this area. I basically followed my wife. She had a job here. And I thought, I'm an engineer, I can get a job. And it turned out there were lots of jobs for people with my background, high performance computing, except they were mostly classified jobs. And living in Europe for 6 years made it a bit difficult to get a clearance. Although now that I look back, today we say, yeah, wow, it takes forever to get a clearance, like a year and a half. And for me, they were saying, yeah, it'll take you a long time, like a year and a half. How things have changed, but stayed the same. And then there was a recruiter, and I'm hoping some of your viewers are old enough to remember recruiters. He didn't just try to send my resume out. He actually read it. He actually knew the companies that he was working with. And he said, I've got the perfect position for you. I have to say, it's one I never would have applied for. It was in telecommunications. And actually talking with the people, they were like, yeah, if you sent us your resume, we never would have talked to you. But this recruiter said, hey, you all want to just talk. That was MCI. And as I say, the rest is kind of history. That got me into telecommunications. After MCI, I worked at Cable and Wireless. I ran their fax business. Again, another, boy, I'm coming up with all the buggy whips. After that, I went and turned around a service bureau, turning it into an equipment manufacturer. And that kind of started a string of turnarounds I did in the telecommunications, network equipment, and network services space. Sold about 5 companies in 9 years. Now, most of that was intentional. I did make vice president of engineering before I was 35. I would say that, slide into telecom was coincidence, right? After all of those companies, I had started another wireless advertising company that was going nowhere. In the middle in there, I was nominated for the FCC Technical Advisory Committee, the first one. My brother, who is Apple's basically local corporate counsel here, was very enmeshed with the FCC. He, with Mike Marcus and Mike Nelson, did this technology that's not a buggy whip, it's Wi-Fi. So he obviously knew a lot of people at the commission. My work, a lot of those network equipment companies were about voice over IP. The reason they were convening a TAC was help us with voice over IP. My brother found out I made it to the last selection round. But then when they announced who was on it, everyone from industry had a PhD. So I think I knew what happened. Was in a meeting with Doug Sigger, who ran that process at the FCC. And about halfway through that meeting, he was like, I remember you. You were the guy that was perfectly qualified to be on the TAC, but didn't have a PhD. And he said, but don't feel bad. Henning Schulzringe, who is my immediate predecessor as FCC CTO, who basically created the voice over IP standards that made the whole revolution possible. He said, yeah, he was also deemed unqualified. Yes, he had a PhD, but he didn't have tenure yet. So obviously, me, who had started a few voice over IP companies, and he, who basically invented all the standards, were obviously not qualified. So he lords it over me to this day that he got me to get my PhD.
Okay, so that leads you to become CTO at some point at the commission. The commission reaches out. How did that happen?
Yeah, so actually it was kind of interesting because before they reached out that time, they had reached out again asking actually if I'd be interested in being CTO, and I kind of went through the process, interviewed, and didn't get it. Then Wayne Layton calls me up and says, hey Eric, would you consider being CTO of the FCC? And I was just thinking Lucy and the football. I was like, are you serious? Is this for real? I was like, no, yeah, really it is. The thing is, building these network equipment companies, standards are very important, especially if you're the upstart, to be able to plug into a network. So I'd done a lot of work in standards, and a focus of mine became STIR, and then later SHAKE, and the protocols for protecting called parties from illegal robocalls. And basically that was the thing. We want you to make this happen. And I want to thank you for your work on the commission, voting for some of these rules and regulations. And also pointing out sometimes when it was like, yeah, are you sure we could do that? And then making the rule better. So I got to the commission to do that, it was blessed.
Did you like the role? There's been critiques. It's a time-limited position. Would you keep it that way if you were?
Yeah. So if you look at the nature of the commission, it's at the end of the day, it's about rulemaking and enforcing those rules and doing things like auctions. And so the economists and the lawyers are basically, and I will attribute this to Bob Cannon. He's the one who taught me this, and it's just, I say it to anyone who asks. The lawyers are practicing lawyers, the economists are practicing economists, and the engineers nowadays are reading briefs. In the older days, they used to be designing detection systems and things like that. There are some very good engineers at the commission. Don't get me wrong, they're not all ossified. But what I like about, or at least my experience with the CTO role, was I'm bringing like that knowledge was stir shaken. You know, I had built it. Henning, who preceded me, had created the SIP standard. You know, so again, you're bringing in this outside information, and if it was a permanent role, you would start to lose that. The other bit, which as a strict constructionist you'd probably appreciate, Communications Act does not say that there shall be a chief technology officer and this is what they do. I mean, yes, the chair gets a certain number of advisors, and they typically go for their legal advisors, their bureau advisors, their outreach advisors. And so the structure of having someone who is hired by the chairman, but is kind of a commission resource, I really like that. Now that said, because it's not the Communications Act, I spoke with all but 2 of my predecessors in that role. It was first called Chief Technologist and then Chief Technology Officer. And what I got back was their experiences ranged from, well, my predecessor had one of you, so I guess I'm supposed to have one. There's an office downstairs, but come back in a year, don't bother me. Through to another one, his experience was the chair said, here's my agenda. So this also kind of dates it, and it wasn't on Exchange yet. Here's my agenda. If you see any meeting you want, just come. If you want a meeting, just pencil it in. So really it's up to the chair what the role is. I really appreciated what Ajit did because, well, for one thing, when I interviewed, I asked him, and this was kind of like a binary thing for me. I asked him, are you looking for me to give you advice, or are you looking for me to justify the decision you've already made? And he said, no, I'm looking for advice. And to his credit, only twice did we disagree. And he did consider my advice, and it wasn't over things that I would quit over. So that was a great experience. The other thing he did, which was, in talking to my predecessors, extremely rare, is, and you might remember, I was bugging you at least once a month. Most chairs, it's like, no, you're my resource. Whereas he's like, no, you're a resource for the commission. All the way through to I had a meeting with Commissioner Clyburn. So for those who might not know, she was the senior minority member. So not one of Ajit's people, although I wouldn't call you Ajit's pretty, you very much kept him in line. As I like to say that was part of your role too. And so I went kind of hand in hand because in our discussion, she came up with a need, particularly for people who were getting subsidized phones. Specifically, it was, yeah, thank you for the phone, but I'm homeless. I don't even have a place to plug it in to charge it. And so we were like, yeah, well, how can we address this? And so I went to Ajit and said, is it okay if he was like, no, that sounds great. So, from that perspective, he was one of the best exemplars of creating that position.
Has it fallen off a little bit, or does the chairman have gotten busy? It doesn't seem to be, since you left, there haven't been...
Yeah, I was extraordinarily disappointed that, especially when, and again, the FCC is independent, but, so for example...
That's debatable. Keep going.
Yeah, well, here's my kind of bit on that. So, I was hired by Ajit, and he did ask for my advice, not to just, be a mouth and sock puppet for him. If I totally disagreed with, his view of the worldview and all that, I wouldn't have done it. So, the fact is, I got hired. So, the FCC is an independent agency appointed by the president, right? So if you don't agree with the presidents, then yeah, there are varying levels of independence there. I mean, the good news is I honor you for your honesty in your term, and the result was you weren't nominated, which really kind of pissed me off. You were just basically saying, this is what it is. Some people didn't like that. I was very disappointed. So I was very disappointed that Chair Rosenworcel apparently didn't even try to get someone. And I think part of it was she didn't really want anyone to give her advice about, and if you look at some of my filings on some of the rules that came out, where I was pointing out, like, this is not how the network works. And I'd say I did that for Jeet with one of, especially the big ruling, the restoring internet freedom. I think I saved him a lot of embarrassment from going from the first draft to the final draft.
Talk a little bit about, you also hold a number of patents, 20 if I understand from reading through your background. A number of them are in, as you mentioned, the VoIP area. What was it like, and what are those patents that people may be cognizant of today? And what did you think have happened in the VoIP industry since it exploded? And are you surprised on where things are now?
Yeah, absolutely. So my highest cited patent is about how to bridge applications from the circuit switched old SS7 world into the SIP voice over IP world. And another one is on, before this invention, people basically were thinking of voice over IP, oh, that's SS7 over packets. And so they still had that mentality of centralized control and one big program that controls all these stupid peripherals. And so one of those patents, which is the second highest cited patent, is on basically using the web model for building applications. Because, and I remember GSMA was so proud, they came out with this thing called Parlay. And what it was they basically wrapped, they said, wow, nobody knows SS7, and we got all these people in IT, they all know Java, so let's wrap SS7 in Java. And so instead of, like 40,000 engineers who knew SS7, and at that time only like 10 million people knew Java, you now have like the 30 engineers who knew SS7 and Java, right? It was like the worst of both worlds. And so this was building upon SIP and the technology called XML, and that architecture of you have smart devices that are, like in this case, interacting with users using voice and video. And it really kind of changed the ecosystem. I will admit, that is part of how I got into Stir, and it's not the standards part. It was our goal was to make it really easy for people to create voice applications. The good news is we succeeded. The bad news is a lot of criminals and fraudsters and scammers have leveraged that technology to make it really easy to do the illegal robocalls. In terms of the transition, something I've learned through my entrepreneurship is the difference between being right and difference between being early and right and wrong is, so we were right. Like that first patent, the highest cited one, the application we used to demonstrate it was voice call screening. It was find out who's calling you first because you want to be reached, but you don't want to be reached by everybody. And then because you're doing that, you can do all sorts of stuff like analyze what's going on with who's trying to call you. We can figure out where you are, figure out how to best connect you, all that. That was around 2000. Today we call it Google Voice, we call it Zoom. Put it in perspective, that patent expired 6 years ago. So no, I didn't make a killing on licensing that patent. And part of the being right but early, after the Communications Act passed in '96, and there was the big build out in '98. Everybody's going to be IP by like 2005. So 2000 is a good time to start a company. And we're looking now 25 years of hindsight. didn't happen that way. In fact, my surprise is how long it's taken. We still have, not tons, but we have a lot of SS7 still out there. The FCC, 2012, 2018, there have been a lot of NPRMs and even orders saying, yep, we're going to turn it off, and it's still there. Now, since I've been on the inside, I recognize, oh, it's not because people are stupid, they want to go. There's some policy issues in there, like who's going to pay, like what's a reasonable interconnection charge, especially if you're a rural operator and you only have one connection to the backbone. And then there's the big one is, oh, does that mean IP is Title II or Title I or whatever? And thank goodness, I don't have to touch that third rail anymore.
So over the years, the critique has been that the internet grew up with security as not a priority, that it's almost like a Christmas tree with strings and strings of interconnected lights that are all dependent on each other. What's your take on that vision of how security's been treated in the internet ecosystem all these days?
Yeah, well, on the one hand, I'm presuming most of your people are coming from telecom, but in case a random person comes across this little video, think of it like cars. When cars were introduced and then mass-produced in the 1910s, safety wasn't a consideration. Now, we wouldn't say, oh, safety wasn't a consideration, so cars aren't safe. You know, over the past 100 years, you know, we've got seat belts, airbags, crush zones, now, you know, a lot of driver assistant, even autonomous driving. So it's a similar thing with the internet. You know, the internet was developed in the late 60s, kind of had experimental networks in the 70s, started to grow in the 80s. And yes, it's true, in those days, it was all operated on a handshake. Yes, there was spam in the 80s, and the community said, don't do that, don't do that. And since, you know, it was like a person, they were like, oh, okay, I won't do that. By 1998, the IATF said, this is really taking off. So after the GII and, you know, the internet was made public, you know, not just a research network, the IATF said, you know, basically, real people are using this now. And so that's when, like, the seatbelts came in. Any protocol since 1998 had to consider security. Now, admittedly, it's kind of like putting a rope in a Volkswagen. So by 2003, the IATF said, no, really, you have to have real security to the point where, in fact, the FBI got a little upset because it's like, well, you guys are putting in too much security, and we're kind of like, can't have too much security. So yes, the internet was not originally envisioned with security in mind, but for the past almost 30 years, and most of the protocols we use are less than 30 years old, consider security deeply.
So I want to delve further into, I call it cybersecurity, or it's one of your core expertise. I really want to get your insight on this. What is your take on the level of cyber preparedness from incidents by American companies and government at large? How prepared are we for events that are happening? Do they do enough? Are people mindful of this, or is it considered a sub-issue to deal with only when something bad happens?
Yeah, you know, if you'd asked me that even just 3 years ago, I probably would say, yeah, no. You know, the companies that cared. You know, banks have been caring deeply for a decade, more than, 15 years now, ever since Iran attacked the banking system. That was kind of a watershed moment. A lot of the critical infrastructure industries kind of have to, because they're regulated, the regulators have kind of woken up to it. And yet, you know, I'm also a pilot. And there's this one company that's like the go-to place for studying for your written exams. And their website didn't have certificates. You're downloading stuff onto your computer, and I actually called them up. I was like, look, and by the way, this is the go-to place for the military written exams as well. So I'm like, you are like the juiciest target on the planet, because just, civil pilots is kind of juicy. Military pilots, that would be a huge win for our adversaries to be in on their machines. And they were like, oh, but it costs $500 to get a certificate, and our hosting provider, we don't have to worry about that. I won't put them under the bus, because today, and it's because of work we did in the ITF to make it real easy, basically made it free to get those certificates and to secure the system. Because at first they were like, we would never do anything like that. It's like, dude, it's not you that I'm worried about. It's you're leaving the door open. And there are a lot of companies, industries that kind of have that it's not my problem attitude, or the give up attitude. Wow, if Google gets hacked, what can I do? So, what should I do?
But do companies have, a number of, and I talked about fiduciary obligations that really impact from the top of the C-level suites? This is going to be an impact on not only their performance, but the company's survival.
That's right. So I'll put two hats on. One is as a university professor, another one of my higher cited, not my highest cited paper, but a higher cited paper is about what happens to a publicly traded company after a data breach. And this was driving a lot of the regulations for breach notification. The theory was that if you had to disclose a data breach, that would impact your stock price, which gives basically the board the fiduciary duty to say, hey, we should protect ourselves against this because it will harm our shareholders. Unfortunately, when we did the analysis, yes, in the 2 weeks after a breach is announced, stock price goes down. Sometimes the stock price goes way down. 6 months to a year later, that stock outperforms its sector. I did this when my student was in the business school at Georgetown. And so you come up with almost the perverse thing of, oh, you want to be a victim of a breach because it'll be good for the stock. Now, and that was not our conclusion, by the way. And we didn't go into the why.
Unlikely to be causation there.
That's right, that's right. And part of it actually may be, just as the banking sector woke up after the Iranian attacks, that the company is like, wow, this is serious, and then they really, kind of beef themselves up. I do serve on a few boards, and one of the greatest days a few years ago, and one of the reasons, because boards tend to want to have diverse views. There's obviously lots of finance people who help you do sales, and like I have that role for a couple of companies. But on a couple of companies, I'm like the cyber guy. Can you, not that I do cyber analysis, that's what your outside people are for, that's what your CISO is for, but the are we considerings. And CISA, a few years ago, they did a bulletin about how companies need to be prepared. And I brought that to a board meeting, which then, briefing the CEO, this CTO of that company came up to me there. He's like, oh, Eric, thank you. Because he's having trouble getting the funding to protect themselves. Now, that said, if I was just an academic, I would say, oh, like you're saying, are companies leaving the doors open? Well, in the physical world, companies know we need to lock the doors at night, we should have a guard, we should walk around and make sure nothing's amiss. And so a lot of theoreticians are like, companies should be spending money. Oh, they're not spending, they should spend more and more until they're spending an infinite amount of money to protect against cyber attacks. And obviously that's not in public policy So that's not a benefit. The thing is, a lot of these attacks, again, moving it to a physical analogy, is a country has invaded the United States and there's a tank rolling through the wall of your warehouse. Nobody expects a private company to protect against that. And we are seeing a lot of nation-state actors doing attacks on companies. So are companies prepared? Depends on the sector. Some of the research we're doing now, and I'll give a shout out to MTIA, thank you very much. It's called the Wireless Heart of America. And what we're doing is building cyber protections, not for the AT&Ts and Verizons, T-Mobiles of the world. They have hundreds of people in their security operations center. They have the latest tools. They don't spend an infinite amount of money, but they probably spend more than some of these rural carriers have in revenue. So we're looking at both technologies to help these smaller carriers protect themselves, but also how they can kind of band together and basically create a consortia that would give them the wherewithal to weather some of these attacks.
You kind of got to my next question, is it to help prevent attacks or at least respond to attacks? Can technology be incredibly helpful here? Is it more research and implementation of advancements, or is it a policy-making side? Is it something where government maybe which would you say, given you've been in both spheres?
Yes. So there are, and we're always coming up with new technologies. In fact, if we look at the Commonwealth Cyber Initiative, we were founded, the governor's vision was, when someone thinks cyber, he wants them to think Virginia. He wasn't thinking of like my role here today. He was just, that kind of big picture, what the view of a CEO is supposed to say, what's the big picture? And then if you look at how that happens, it's research universities who are inventing things. And again, I use a telephone analogy. In the 1950s, Bell Labs did a study, and the conclusion of the study was, given the growth in population and the growth of the use of the telephone, Bell telephone system, when it was still, just AT&T, would employ every woman in the United States to connect phone calls. And that was because they were hiring women. And they actually had a lot of scientific reasons why they were doing that. And then you could say, oh, well, let's be equal opportunity. You would have quickly hired all the men as well. And so the answer was not, oh, how do we find more people to be operators? The answer was digital switching. The answer was technology. We have a similar thing here today with cyber, that we need to take the technology that's already been developed, and that's one of the pillars of the Commonwealth Cyber Initiative. We call it innovation. We help companies take the technologies developed by the universities and bring it to market, because that's what we want to see. We want to see it being used. Workforce development. So on one hand, we're not trying to say every student on the planet should be a cyber warrior, but we still need some people. And that's actually what I like about the Cyber Initiative and why I have all those titles. As a professor at Virginia Tech, I get graded on how many of my PhD students go on to become professors at elite universities. That's perpetuating the PhD wheel. But my research director of the Commonwealth Cyber Initiative, we're looking at all aspects. So CCI has all the public universities and also colleges, like Nova here in Northern Virginia. Most of the private colleges and universities. So yeah, we're producing the PhDs. We're helping to invent our way out. But we're also producing the master's students who are going to work with these companies and build whatever it is that needs buildings. The bachelor's students who are probably going to start the companies. And even the people with the associate's degrees. I mean, we always see Commissioner Carr up on the pole. Someone needs to climb up the pole. And yeah, he's unusual, FCC chair. That's not the usual background of the person who's climbing a pole, but they're all important, right? And so this is like a holistic view of creating that ecosystem of cyber professionals. So technology helps, but again, back to your question of are companies actually doing it? The banking industry did not need to be told by Treasury, you need to protect yourself. They have been protecting themselves from fraud for 500 years, right? This is another modality of fraud. They know they need to protect themselves, but also notice, think of your credit card. And you've got that $50 max liability, they'll eat the rest. Because there is a certain level of spend that's too much. And so they're trying to balance that. And they say, yeah, the occasional loss when we miss something is worth making it easy for the consumer to, in that case, spend money or save money or whatever. However, there are other industries where left to their own devices, and especially since we now have cyber insurance, are like, yeah, I don't need to worry about it. Well, that's where liability regulations could become helpful. In fact, this was when Mr. Shaken. It was a deal that I negotiated with Chairman Pai. He was like, oh, carriers will all do it voluntarily. And I was like, I'm not sure that they're going to do it voluntarily. And the reason was not because they were lazy or because they wanted to save money. Because in fact, I was talking to my colleagues in OEA, the economists, because I showed that if everyone implemented Stir and Shaken, the carrier's costs would go down. And the economists were like, so why do we need a regulation? In their self-interest, won't they just do it? And it's like, yes, their costs will go down, but when AT&T implements it, when they spend the money to implement it, they're reducing the cost for Verizon and T-Mobile. When T-Mobile does it, it's reduced for AT&T and everybody else. And so they're rational actors. They all want to do it, and they all want to do it last, which means nobody will do it. And so we will definitely not name names here, but as I went in as CTO with kind of this mandate to make it happen, one of my colleagues, Vice President of Network Engineering at one of the large carriers, said, Eric, please make us do this. And so that was like a useful role of regulation, is it did actually rise the tide for everybody. And it was a scenario where, yeah, we all needed to do it. Similar thing with cyber, because it's an interconnected world. So like I was saying, this app that helped pilots do their written tests, but now you got it on your laptop that you take on base. Things hop from there to the base, hops to Department of War, all that, very bad. So sometimes we do need some regulation to at least raise the awareness and the flag that, no, this is something you have to do.
Switch topics slightly bit. One of your expertise is also in the wireless world. You've been aggressive and active in 5G. I want to get your thoughts on 6G, where given your history and experience, when people talk about the timing, 2030, the end of the decade, we're going to have 6G, the standards will be ready. And do you think that the market is ready for that? Do you think the carriers are preparing for that? What's your take on 6G?
Yeah, well, and why I got very involved with 6G was the United States dropped the ball on 5G. So after the FCC, I went to the White House, and one of the inducements for doing it was, some people were saying that, well, we were doing things really for cyber reasons, protecting ourselves from untrusted network equipment. And some people were saying, oh, you're doing that to protect domestic industry. And double-edged sword here, I, with my head held high, said, We are absolutely not doing this to protect domestic industry because we don't really have domestic industry. We had and still have a handful of very small wireless network equipment manufacturers. All of the majors are not from the United States. So on the one hand, I could come in and say, we're not doing this because we don't have a wireless industry. Why don't we have a wireless industry? And that was one of my motivations to go over to the White House is, how do we create policies to encourage and nurture the domestic industry? And if you think, part of it, and it did come from an attitude that the US carriers did, and actually many carriers around the world, we don't need to get involved with defining 5G. Our vendors will do that for us. Well, here's one surprise for you. The vendors are considering the vendors' needs first. And in particular, since we kind of abdicated our standards leadership, China filled that void. And so it's not a surprise that there's a lot of good in 5G. But it also kind of reflects Chinese priorities. We were talking about security and how the IETF has security built in for anything since 2003. The Chinese made sure that they could easily do mass surveillance. The Chinese made sure that the assumption was basically that carrier was an arm of the state. And so there were all sorts of things that you might maybe have some security, but that's optional. And believe me, it's turned off in China. Those are not the values that we have in the United States, North America, that most of the our like-minded partners. And so that really reinvigorated, started with stuff in the White House, and then Addis started the Next G Alliance. And it really was to restore North American leadership in wireless deployments, and not just technology, because a lot of the 5G technology came from United States universities, but it was not taken up by us. It was taken up by a little bit in Europe and a lot in China. And so to bake in 6G, again, like we were talking about the IDF, real privacy, strong security, the presumption that the deployment is by a private carrier that is subject to the rule of law, but they are not an arm of the state. Carriers are interested in it. This does go, and everyone talks about how the even Gs deliver on the promise of the odd Gs. Going back to one of your earlier questions, I got involved in 3G because I came from the internet world. You heard my background there. I came kind of late to telecom. And so I came from the internet view of the world, and 3G, it's packet-based, we're gonna have packet voice, and we're gonna have internet-based applications. And then I find out, oh no, people are doing the circuit switch stuff, and what happened? LTE had voice over LTE. So 4 kind of delivered on the promise of 3. 5 really had the real promise of 3. It's like, yeah, we've got software-based network components in the architecture, but it's really still boxes. 6G, I say, is not only delivering on the promise of 5G, but it's delivering on the promise of 3G. There are going to be a lot of new applications coming out. Again, I'll give a shout out to NTIA and the NSF. They've been funding research, and so NSF on the research side, NTIA more on the deployment side, of new applications, and the new applications driving the demand that carriers kind of need to see, because again, we got this chicken and egg thing. Presuming we actually do get the standards done by 2030, and it looks like we are kind of on track for that, carriers are going to need the same thing they've needed for 5G, 4G, and 3G. If I build it, will anyone buy it? And until they build it, no one's going to want to buy it. So where's the market demand generation? And that is actually a useful role of government, as we said a long time, 100 years ago, prime the pump.
Talk about a different technology that actually is subsumed in telecom and actually in cyber as well, artificial intelligence. What's your take on how that, it's been in the news recently as it relates to cyber. You got Anthropic mythos, right? And in terms of what it may point out flaws in the network. Is that a good thing, a bad thing? What does it mean for the telecom side of the equation?
Again, the answer is yes. And in fact, if you asked me 3 weeks ago, again, would have had the first half of the answer, but now the second half of the answer is a bit different. The first half of the answer is we have to use AI in the network. That is actually one of the foundational principles of 6G. We have a lot of work here on using AI for beamforming, finding devices, which means we can do spectral reuse, which means we can have more people in the same area, which means it reduces cost. And typically when that happens in telecom, you get more usage. So again, the carrier's like, yeah, that's a good thing. We're using AI for managing the network, self-healing systems. So there's a lot of AI that's going into the network, both on the network operations side, the actual technology, and the security side. And a lot of that is because there's just a lot of manual drudgery work in running a security operations center, and a lot of that can be automated. I got involved with cyber around creating standards for cyber threat intelligence sharing. And the purpose of that was because back 15 years ago, if I'm attacked and I figure out what happened, I want to share it with you so that either you can go, oh gosh, I'm under attack and I didn't know it. Because in those days, it was 9 months before you realized someone was in your network. So that could shorten it. Or the attack hasn't happened yet, you know what to look for, you know what to fix. And the way I did that was I wrote it up as a Word document and sent you a PDF. The next day, you would open up the PDF and, oh, like this IP address is bad, you would cut and paste it. So, operating at the speed of humans. And by the way, you would get more than one of these a day, right? So we wanted to automate that. So clearly, automation has been on our mind. A thing that we kind of knew was on the horizon was our adversaries using AI. And we were thinking in terms of, they're going to be using AI to probe systems, then eventually they're going to use AI to pry into systems. That is happening. And in a sense, we're talking machine speed, machine intelligence. You need machine speed, machine intelligence to defend against that. Mythos dropped a couple of things on us all at once. The first thing it did is identified, I won't say the number, a whole bunch of what would have been 0 days. If you look at the articles, there's a famous one, something that's been latent for 26 years. And Mythos found it. Nobody found it over all this time. The good news is, we don't believe our adversaries have found it. The bad news is, it's now found. And once something is found, it's only a matter of time for our adversaries to find it. Yes, Anthropic is, or so far has shown itself to be a very responsible company. Instead of saying, wow, great, we got this tool, and look, it finds all of these 0 days that can kick down the world, they said, oh my goodness. They disclosed to the White House, they've disclosed to a number of other government agencies, they've disclosed to select partners. Hey, we gotta button this up really fast. Now, part of that is, if Anthropic is to be believed, yes, Mythos they're ahead. They found all these bugs that the other frontier models haven't found. How many weeks before the other frontier models are able to find. And if even 10% of those bugs is still going to be devastating. So the double whammy is industry is scrambling to patch those problems that have been found because keeping Mythos secret is not going to keep that out of the hands of our adversaries. And it means kind of the days of that active attacking, that intelligent, unsupervised attacking is here now. So kind of tying back into your early question, security operations centers, there are like known red teaming tools. And again, they were created to help make networks more secure. But if you don't implement what's found, the bad guys are using it too. Well, Mythos was not an attack tool, it was a defense tool. Pretty obvious how it's going to be an attack tool. And so now, it's not just look for these holes that we know about, it's got to be looking for all this probing going on all the time.
Last question, I promise. You've been inside of government, you've been outside, you've been in academia. What advice would you give to policymakers that are in this space today, whether it be the worlds have blended in telecom and the internet, or technology side of the equation is very blended. What advice would you give to them on what they should be looking for and doing to help facilitate the growth for the benefit of American people?
Yeah, well, if I had my magic wand, there are kind of three areas. One is, we were talking about we need to invent our way out of this. The president's current budget is calling for effectively a 65% cut in NSF research funding. And that is going to hit, in fact, it's already hit telecom research. There was only so much stuff that probably should have been cut, but this is going beyond, this is like cutting off limbs. This is not just cutting to the bone. And the NSF is without a confirmed director. So those two things are basically leaving our research establishment in chaos. And on the one hand, people say, well, don't we get a lot of funding from the Department of War? And we do. That's very important for telecommunications. And yeah, the top line, the headline is increased Department of War budget by 50%. But again, if you look at the budget, the first budget request has Department of War R&D funding cut by about 10%. Again, not sending a message, and especially for like my students, it's not sending a message that, oh, so maybe I should be studying law because there are going to be all these lawsuits over it. That's what we want them studying telecommunications, computer science, computer engineering to solve our way out of these problems. So restoring NSF funding, having a NSF director, NIST. NIST is also a little bit in disarray right now. NIST is where we get our cybersecurity standards from for the federal civilian government. And by the way, again, talking fiduciary duty, that it's obvious we do it. Why should we do it if we're gonna, if Google gets attacked? And the answer is usually, the law definition is reasonable and customary. Well, NIST did the cybersecurity framework. We set the definition of reasonable and customary. You do this stuff, you're kind of safe harbored. You don't, well, when you lose cyber roulette, you lose big. So again, there's no director there. Future's kind of uncertain. So really, in a sense, this is like, and both of these are like Congress needs to restore the budget and confirm directors, and the White House needs to support that. And then, we are seeing, a need to not back off. All the good work that was done in the first administration to really support the wireless ecosystem. to really kind of, again, double down. I was heartened to see that the Biden administration had doubled down on what we did in the Trump administration, and that's like an opportunity to quadruple down in this administration.
Well, that's very important thoughts, and I really appreciate that. I can't thank you enough for your time. It's been an incredibly interesting conversation, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.